So thank you so much. It's so much fun to be out in the world. I think you guys probably all know what a very, very long process getting a book actually to its publication date is. And a lot of people ask what it felt like to finally hold it in my hands for the first time. And I know that other authors have posted pictures on Instagram or little video clips of them sort of like having these overwhelming moments. And I got my box at some point a few months ago and I was like, yeah, this has been a long time coming, so thank goodness. And it just seems like the waiting was never ending, but it's so much fun now to be out and to be hearing back from people who are reading Essie, and to sort of be learning a little bit more about the book selling community as well. And it's just been lovely to be on the road. I was up in North Conway, New Hampshire just a little while ago and was lucky enough to stay with my parents. And I realized that it was the first time I had been in their house without my kids in ages. And it was just so quiet and peaceful. So the Book of Essie is my first novel. It tells the story of Esther Ann Hicks, who's the youngest daughter of an evangelical preacher who has not only been broadcasting his sermons on air for as long as she's been alive, but their family has also been the subject of a reality show, Six for Hicks, and so she's essentially grown up on television. Let me talk a little bit about my history, and that'll dovetail right into sort of how and why I ended up writing this book in particular. So Steph mentioned that I'm a physician, which is true. Before I was a physician, I was going to be an astronaut, like full on planned to be an astronaut. But at some point during undergraduate, I realized that that doesn't really happen for many people, and I should come up with a backup plan. And so was very interested in the sciences, very interested in specifically children, and working with them. And so the question of whether to go to medical school or to work with children in another capacity, I think either way I would have ended up in something related with pediatrics. And so decided to go to medical school, but I had been kicking around this idea that I should just write a book as if this were something that just happens without any sort of advanced preparation or say like sitting down to do it. And I knew that there were people at my undergraduate who were aspiring writers. Across the hall from me, my freshman year, was a young man who was lovely, a little bit quirky, and was planning a trip to Eastern Europe to do some research for a novel. And I was like, that's just not a thing people do. And years later, Jonathan Safran Foer was like on TV promoting Everything is Illuminated. And I was like, oh, it is a thing people do. Good for him. But I had been taught from a very young age that the arts, while very, very important, do not pay the bills usually. And so my mom, who I think carries with her a fair amount of anxiety for my welfare and my brother's welfare and our sort of stability, had made it very clear that she loved that we were readers. She wanted us to be involved in choir and to be musicians. And she was just overjoyed at the thought that I would maybe want to pursue singing. But I needed to be okay with being a music teacher. And she would have been overjoyed for me to pursue writing, but I needed to be okay with being an English teacher. And she sort of thought that those were the careers that were rational and would pay your bills, and that you couldn't count on sort of making any money from things that she considered important, but just sort of a passion. And so I did not go that route, and I thought that I would go into the sciences because young women should go into the sciences and represent. And so went to medical school, still sort of carrying around this idea that I should write a book, still had not sat down to write anything. And then toward the end of my third year in medical school, at the point at which you start to apply to residency and you're sort of committing yourself for that next block of years of your life, I realized that if I didn't do it then, I was never going to get a chance to do it, even though I still wasn't sure what it was because I had never written anything. And so I decided to take a year off, and my medical school was very gracious to give me a leave of absence. And that should have been as simple as it was. But I was very afraid of going, realizing that I couldn't write at all, and then coming back with this empty hole in my resume that I would then have to explain away when I was applying to residency programs. So I did what any type A person would do. I got myself into a master's program at Oxford University so that I could live abroad, be around people with accents, sit in the pub with Tolkien's like picture on the wall. And I thought, that would be a way to be inspired. So I had a plan for that year, which turned into 2 years, but I was going to get the master's. I was going to write a novel. I was going to find a husband. And if he happened to be in the royal family, then that would be great. I did find a husband. He's not in the royal family, but it's been very vindicating to see someone named Meghan marry into the royal family after all these years. So I did have a little bit more time on my hands when I was there studying for my master's. And so I wrote a manuscript, sent it off, Googled how do you publish a book. And this was sort of before the advent of self-publishing. And so that wasn't really an option. It just sort of advised that you find an agent. So I Googled how you find an agent. And all of this was sort of by snail mail back then because people didn't really accept emails. Everything was still a little bit more formalized. And so I sent the manuscript off, or just the chunk of it that they had requested via their website, and was lucky enough to find an agent to represent me for that manuscript. Not lucky enough to get it published. That was like 12 years ago. But it was a very interesting learning experience as to sort of how things work, how over time, if you're not able to keep up with the edits that they want you to do, say because you're an intern at Boston Children's Hospital, that things don't happen if you don't put the work in. And so it became clear that I should put that manuscript on hold because I just really didn't have the time for it. They encouraged me to write some nonfiction while I was in residency, which I did, and that ultimately became the book Between Expectations, which is a collection of essays about being a resident, which I'm proud of in that I wrote it real time as I was going through residency. And I think at the end of the day, sort of my agent's criticism was like, could this like have a little bit more glow to it, a little bit more like circle back and tell us what happened with those patients? And you're like, well, I don't know because I didn't have control over my life. And I think, what's important is to represent what that feels like, to not have control, to not have closure, to not have sort of like a ribbon tied up on it at the end. And so that was published right as I was finishing residency. And again, that was just sort of my first foray into understanding how publishing works. And so I had it in the back of my mind that I should sit down and write that novel. And many years went by when I was primarily involved in not changing diapers and just not going insane with my kids, who were young and wonderful, but very, very crazy. And during that time, fortuitously, my parents had decided to retire and they moved in with us and helped out with our childcare. And so in the context of then having a little bit more time because my mom was willing to help, and also living with my parents again for the first time in a very long time, I started to re-examine what it meant to be their daughter. As an adult, I began to re-examine a lot of my own childhood experiences. And so when I had been young, my father, who's an Episcopal priest, had the sort of job where he has a parish, there's a rectory, you live in the rectory, it's a small town, and everyone knows who you are. And so I grew up with a sort of scrutiny that I think every small child feels, like as you talk to people, everyone feels that adults are watching them, judging them, making sure that they're not misbehaving. For me, it felt a little bit amplified, a little bit more acute. And I remember sort of being elbowed by my mom in church to not fidget or pick my nose or do anything else that might embarrass the family. And I had this real sense that not only would it be embarrassing to them, but that it could jeopardize our finances. Because when you get called to a new parish, they interview the spouse, they look at the kids. And so my dad's future jobs could very well have depended on my behavior. And I don't know that I had the words to describe it at the time, but it just felt sort of like this very tense, unspoken thing in my family, that behavior was very important, and somehow tied to my dad and his job. And so as I was sitting down to sort of try my hand at writing again, I had this vision of this young girl who, not unlike myself or my perception of what my scenario was at the time, felt very much as if she was watched over, who did not really have privacy, did not really have control over her choices, over her future. And there's a scene very close to the beginning, I think in the 3rd chapter, where Essie, who's the daughter, reaches out to a reporter named Liberty Bell to ask for help. And there's this very finite piece of time after the production manager leaves and the cameras are not rolling and no one is watching, and she needs to sort of establish communication with Liberty then, or else the chance is lost. And so the novel sort of came out of that moment of asking for help, and then evolved from there. So in addition to being told from Essie's standpoint, it's also told in 2 other voices. So Rourke Richards is a young man at her high school who she has identified as a potential accomplice in her plot to gain some freedom and autonomy in her life. And Liberty Bell, this journalist, who she's going to use for the publicity that she can provide. And so it came very much from my own experiences. My dad, however, is an Episcopalian, not an evangelical. I grew up in a small church, whereas Essie's dad has a mega church with, the screens at the front and all of the pomp and circumstance that comes with it. And that was very different than the experience that I had had growing up in church, where it was very personal. Like, the community was very small. Everyone looked out for each other. And you had a personal relationship with the folks who were on the vestry, or the folks who were in the choir, or the folks who were my actual folks, and in charge of the church. And I thought a lot about what the story would be if it were set in the Episcopal Church, because I think my goal in writing this was to sort of address some of the hypocrisy that can exist when people in power do not behave in private the way that they do in public, and when they can get away with things and no one calls them on it because of their power, because they're untouchable. I think that exists everywhere. We've certainly seen it in the Hollywood community this year, and there certainly has been quite a rise in people taking a stand and speaking out against injustice when they see it, which is excellent. But I think in religion, it's sort of got an added layer of difficulty, because these are people that you trust with your spiritual life. These are people that you think of as having a special connection with God, and people who can become godlike to you. And so I thought very much about what this would look like, this story, if it were set in a small New England town like the one I grew up in an Episcopal church. And I felt like, not only would you lose some of the visual of having the mega church, where there's that disconnect and that sort of insertion of technology in the place of that very physical, personal connection, just because there's too much traffic in New England to ever get a mega church going, and real estate's too expensive to buy a plot of land that big. But I think if this were, set in the Episcopal Church, something dramatic would happen in the first 30 pages, and then there'd be like 300 pages of people apologizing to each other and trying to serve coffee and tea. But that's not to say that same hypocrisy doesn't exist in all communities. And so I certainly didn't write this as a condemnation of the evangelical community. But if you were to look at our political spectrum, and if you were to look at sort of, what denomination is very prominent in terms of being out there and sort of staking their claim on certain values, the evangelical church has been doing that lately. And so it seems sort of a natural follow-up. The other thing that I thought was really interesting about the rise of evangelical churches and non-denominational churches in general is that there's not really a power structure in the same way that there is, in the Episcopal Church or the Catholic Church, which is not to say that the Catholic Church did not botch that power structure and just ignore things anyway. But there's not as much sort of oversight or hierarchy. And so you can imagine a character like Esther's father, Pastor Hicks, who has sort of free reign to interpret the scripture the way he interprets the scripture, regardless of what other people in the community might think, and his word sort of becomes God, right? And so I thought that would be more interesting, a read and a narrative. It would provide more tension than placing it in the Episcopal Church, although I fully acknowledge that this is not the church that I grew up in. That said, there were some very prominent scandals at the time that I was writing, in which sort of youth pastors and other ministry officials in the evangelical church had turned a blind eye to very inappropriate behavior. And so I thought that was interesting to comment on. And then you have young women like Rachel Den Hollander, who's the first woman to step forward and accuse Larry Nassar of the abuse in the gymnast. She wrote very, very eloquently about being a young woman in the evangelical church in a role where she provided counseling and ministry to young women who had suffered abuse, even before she had come public with her own experiences, and the sort of very dismissive, very misogynistic comments that were made to her that marginalized the experiences of those young women is unacceptable in my mind. And so I think that my hope is that people of all denominations, people of all walks and creeds will enjoy the story for what it is, and then not feel that it's sort of a condemnation of evangelical beliefs, but sort of look within all of our communities, because we all have that tendency toward self-preservation and hypocrisy. I mean, doctors certainly do. Doctors sort of can do no wrong the way they do it, and then there's a lot of sort of snide remarks about what the hospitals at the doctors at the other hospital did before they transferred the patient to you. And everyone's supposed to be on the same team there, so you would think that wouldn't exist, but I think it does, no matter what we do. Before I just do a brief reading, I just want to highlight these 3 books, because I think part of what has been really interesting about this experience for me is learning a little bit more about the publishing business. And at some point someone had said, if you want to publish a book, you should go to your favorite books and look in the back and try to figure out who their agent is or who their editor is. And that'll give you some guidance as to sort of like who might be your people, who might be the folks that your story resonates with. And so to show you that makes no sense at all, these are 3 books that were all bought by my editor. So my editor bought Essie and championed her. She's also Chris Bajalian's editor. His most recent is The Flight Attendant. This is a thriller, like a true thriller about a young woman who wakes up next to a dead body in Dubai, and then international intrigue follows. And it's quite a gripping read, not at all like Essie. The Glitch by Elizabeth Cohen. This is a galley, but it came out last month, about a female CEO who's very like Marissa Mayer type, lean in, and I think some people have read this and not realized that it's satire, and they're like, this narrator's really unlikable, and you're like, yes, she is, and that is the point. She does realize what she's missing in the end, but it's very well done. Anne Elizabeth Cohen lived upstairs from Jonathan Safran Foer and I, which I realized when I saw her again, and we were like, why do we know each other? And we're like, oh, we use the same bathroom in Witherspoon way back when. She, like I, had a career and then came back to writing. And then Jenny Jackson also championed Station 11, which is the first of Emily St. John Mandel's books to be published at Knopf. And she had previously been with a small independent publisher. This is a very lovely literary novel about a traveling Shakespearean troupe of musicians and actors after a flu pandemic basically destroys all of humanity, and those who are left are stuck tramping through the wilderness of the Michigan Lake District, because apparently gasoline expires, which I didn't realize. And now I know. So useful post-apocalyptic tip right there. You can't count on the gasoline after a certain number of years. So all three of those books, plus Essie, were championed by the same lovely, wonderful woman, Jenny Jackson at Knopf and Doubleday. And they're not all the same. So I think that the bottom line is that none of this probably makes any sense. You hope for the best. If I figure it out, I will let you know. But that, if you can try to tell a story well, and tell a story that you're passionate about, then you hope that it goes somewhere and that somebody else will sort of enjoy being on the ride with you. So I'm just going to read a short passage from the beginning of the book. And so it was important to me. Esther, Rourke, Liberty all have separate narratives, and they sort of trade off mid-conversation sometimes so that you're getting the different viewpoints. And it was important to me, I think, to not do what some people do sometimes when you've got a first-person narrator, which is have them learn information in very sneaky ways because you need to put that in the book. And so some of my favorite books have people who eavesdrop and do other things that are very uncharacteristic of them, just because this little tidbit needed to be included. That always kind of drove me crazy. And so I thought about whether I could tell the story from Essie's point of view alone, and it just seemed like it would be so much richer, and Rourke and Liberty would, they deserve their own space as well. And so wanted to give them that space and make sure that if I was going to do it that way, that they got about equal space with Essie. And so they all have the same number of chapters, except for Essie has one more at the end just to tie things up. And I'll just give you a sense of Essie's voice, and then we'll go from there. And this is just a couple Bible passages at the beginning. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. That was from the Book of Esther. On the day I turned 17, there is a meeting to decide whether I should have the baby, or if sneaking me to a clinic for an abortion is worth the PR risk. I am not invited, which is just as well, since my being there might imply that I have some choice in the matter, and I know that I have none. I listen in, though, the way Lissa and I used to before she went away. It was Lissa who discovered the vent in the wall of the laundry room, who realized that you could eavesdrop on everything that was said in the production office if you climb onto the dryer and put your ear up against the filigreed bronze grate. I guess eavesdropping for her is second nature. I just talked about eavesdropping. I was like, I don't want anyone to do that if it's not what they do, but I guess it's what she does. On page 1. The winter Lissa broke her leg, she was 14 and I was 9. I remember she chose an orange cast that Mother hated, and the doctor laughed and said something about Lissa being a firecracker. And Mother frowned but didn't dare to disagree, not with the cameras rolling. I could tell she was worried that the color was too bright, that it would bleed on screen, or at the very least be distracting. It lasted only a second, the withering look she shot my sister as the fiberglass was unwrapped and wound round and round the crack above Lissa's ankle. But even at 9, I was well versed in Mother's methods of wordless communication. I knew exactly what to look for. Just as I knew to look for the flash of defiance in Lissa's eyes that was my sister's only reply. The doctor signed the cast when he was done, and so did all the nurses. Then Lissa and I were given popsicles for the ride home. They were orange to match the cast, but Mother made us throw them in the trash as soon as we reached the parking lot. She said the sugar would ruin our teeth, but I think really she did it just to punish us, to remind Lissa that she shouldn't count on the cameras for protection, that they might delay the consequences of her action, but would never entirely prevent them. She needn't have bothered. It was the first lesson any of us learned. That cast was the reason it became my job to climb up and report everything the grown-ups said, because Lissa couldn't do it herself without breaking the only good leg she had left. It's possible that without that orange cast, Lissa would never have told me about the vent at all, since trusting me was a risk. She might have kept the secret to herself, ferreting away this little piece of knowledge the way she used to hide the chocolate bars she stole from Stahl's sweet shop when she stopped in with Becca Tomey on their way home from school. Lissa never bought anything, but Becca was allowed to spend her allowance on whatever she wanted. In any case, that was how it seemed. Lissa and I, on the other hand, were allowed chocolate only on birthdays and Easter. I always wondered, after she was gone, and I found the box of unopened candy under her bed, why she bothered to steal them at all, why she took such a chance. If she had been found out, it wouldn't have been only Daddy's paddle she'd have had to contend with. Mother's silent punishment would have been much worse. It meant something, I realized, that Lissa could sneak the Milky Ways into her bag without Mr. Stahl noticing, yet never bring herself to open them. Eating the chocolate, I saw much later on, would have been the thing that made the stealing real. The dryer is running and slightly warm when I sit on it. It's a pleasant sensation, but the clang of some sort of metal clip getting thwacked against the drum covers up the sound of the producer speaking on the other side of the wall, so I turn the dryer off. Once the drum has stopped turning, I can hear well enough to make out what Candy is saying. The name fits her, sweet as sugar but hard enough to break a tooth on. She has been with us since before I was born, since that first Christmas special, when Maddie was not quite 3 and my parents had just been told that there would be no more children. Daddy had spent so much time on television by then, you'd have thought it would have come naturally. But Mother said he was as nervous as a pig in a bacon factory the day the new crew started filming. Up until then, the cameras had only been at church, where they were entirely under Daddy's control. Could he tell then that the balance of power was subtly shifting? In any case, Mother had to force Daddy to let the crew into the house, and even then he did this thing where he scratched his wrist incessantly any time the cameras were pointed at him. Candy's team did their best to edit this out, to use the close-ups of his pensive expression and his clear blue eyes. But there are a few shots where you can see him moving his fingers back and forth compulsively, as if possessed, like an addict scratching at invisible bugs burrowing just beneath his skin. Mother stole the show, though, so it didn't matter. She cried real tears when she revealed their struggles to conceive, their disappointment. She was candid when she confessed that they had always wanted a big family, a brood, a flock, to tend and raise up in His grace and light. After all, if children are a gift from God, surely Daddy was deserving of more than just a single blessing, since he had made it his life's work to speak His truth and praise His name, even in these darkest days. Mother sighed and reached out and took my father's hand then, stilled it, and held it tight to keep him from scratching. With her eyes turned up to the ceiling, the tears welled at first but did not fall. Then Mother looked directly at the camera and breathed something about accepting God's will, and those fat drops rolled right down her tastefully rouged cheeks, as if she had control over gravity itself. That hour-long special probably would have just been a one-off, since Daddy said the focus should be on his ministry, not on his family. But on Christmas Eve, they found out that Daniel was on the way, and people called it an honest-to-God miracle, and there was no stopping after that. 9 months later, when my brother was born, 10 million people tuned in to see it happen. Not the actual moment, of course, but everything leading up to it. The praying, the hand-holding, the reciting of bits of verse. Then he was lifted, slick and shrieking and still streaked with blood, and Daddy let loose a heartfelt alleluia, and a regular television phenomenon was born. So I'll stop there. And so in the next chapter you meet Rourke, and in the chapter after that you meet Liberty Bell, and you realize from the outset that none of them have very much in common on the surface, and none of them are particularly inclined to trust each other. But by the end of the book, they've formed an unlikely friendship, and one that I hope you'll enjoy reading about. So maybe stop there for now and open up to questions if anyone has anything. Bring it on.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to take up all your time. But I guess I want to know, I'm one of my guilty pleasures, obsessions, is kind of keeping track of where all these really kind of over-the-top evangelicals are out there, and there are a lot of them that I've discovered, and it's really disturbing, especially in this political climate where we are. And so I guess I'm wondering, have you discovered these groups online? This is where they are. And did you do that sort of research for what you've written? I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Yeah, so I mean, I did a bit. I think that I relied a lot on conversations sort of with my dad and with other clergy, even conversations I'd had long before envisioning this book, to sort of get the basis of what it was like to grow up, or to have that be your life's work. And I dipped a little bit into things that are available online. I think the sort of like warning there is that all of that stuff gets really nasty really quickly sometimes. And so I didn't find that it was useful to sort of read the same sort of bigoted statements over and over again. I found it really sort of soul-crushing. And so even though that's a tiny sort of little sliver of humanity on the internet, they tend to be pretty vocal, whether conservative Christians or not conservative Christians. And so I tried, I did try to read articles in sort of mainstream publications. There was a really beautiful interview with a young lady who, unfortunately, I meant to look her name up because I just keep blanking on it, but she had grown up in the Westboro Baptist Church and had been made in charge of their Twitter account. And so her job was to say pretty nasty things on the internet and blame the Jews for everything. And so, she got a lot of hateful, I think, sort of appropriate responses to sort of say, like, that's ridiculous, don't do that. And one person in particular sort of was humorous about it and engaged with her a little bit more in a way that wasn't just sort of shutting down all communication. And they ended up having a really interesting Twitter relationship over time, and she eventually sort of began to question the extreme nature of the views with which she had been raised, and ultimately left the church. Got together with the young man.
Is that where Eric came from?
Where what?
Where Eric came from in the book. Is his name Eric?
Work?
No.
I think Mike.
Mike.
Brebell's husband.
Yes.
Oh, Mike. Sorry.
Yes.
Thanks.
No.
No. That sounds so similar.
Yeah. And so that was my inspiration for that piece of it. And she's written just quite beautifully about sort of what that internal transition was for her. And I don't think it always ends in romance, but I liked the idea that, people who, if you take everything else away, could really understand each other. That, maybe all this nastiness that we surround ourselves with on the internet would sort of dissipate, and we would find common ground. That would be lovely if that were true. Yeah, so that was the inspiration for Mike. And I should remember her name. I should look it up again because she's amazing.
Forgot Mike's name, so.
Yeah. What other questions do people have?
What about the research for the reality TV part of it? Because a lot of the details of the plot sort of hinge on like the way production worked and stuff like that. So I mean, it sounded like it all. Did you make it up?
Yeah, I mean, some of it I made up because
it
it was helpful, for Essie to have some time in front of the camera and some time not in front of the camera. I have a friend who's a producer, had been a producer on The Bachelor at the time. And so she was lovely and available to bounce questions off of. But the sense that I got from her sort of early on was that there was a lot of variability in sort of how shows are shot. And so I felt comfortable taking some liberty with how their show would have been structured. I think that a lot of people want to know how much I binge watched reality shows, like in preparation for writing this. And I tried not to because I think, again, it was one of those things that I found a little bit unhealthy. I have watched my fair share of America's Next Top Model because, like, they become so beautiful. It's like crazy. And just really interesting from a photography standpoint to sort of see everything that goes into sort of making pictures like that. And then I was obsessed with Teen Mom when it first came out. And I think I was in residency at the time, or else I was watching like when they re-aired things in like, binge-worthy fashion. And I was not able to fall asleep sometimes when I had been up for like 30 hours, but I also wasn't able to be like functional. So it was sort of like the perfect level of engagement. And I didn't mind if I like fell asleep on the couch. The other thing that is just sort of important to mention is that like even though I was not watching reality shows as I was writing it very much, I still knew what the Kardashians were up to. Like, I still knew what the Duggars were up to, because, like, you can't avoid them. They've become so mainstream, and so if you have any interaction with social media, as, like, budding young authors are supposed to be, I'm not young anymore, but that's okay, but you're supposed to sort of be present on social media and read the news, and if you do, it's sort of, like, peppered with all of this ridiculousness. And so, I certainly... people are free to get their entertainment wherever they get it. I hope they will get it from reading my book. But if you are, somebody who likes reality shows, fine. If you are somebody who doesn't, also fine. But I think we all have to sort of question where we've come as a society. If Kim Kardashian can get somebody pardoned by the president just because she read about it on Twitter. Like, that's insane to me. And that's not to say that that woman probably didn't deserve to be pardoned, but how many other people are out there who don't have Kim Kardashian rooting for them? I sort of wonder what's wrong with our whole system if being a celebrity carries such weight. When I was first sort of meeting with my editor for the very first time for lunch in New York, which I thought was very, cool, I sort of said, what can I do in preparation, right? Because it was going to be a full year and a half before the book came out. And aside from try to build a social media platform, which I failed abysmally at, was there anything that I could do to try to get my name out there in preparation for the book to come out so that people would be like, oh, that Meghan Weir, read this book. And I said, should I start writing short fiction? We could try to get it placed in a literary magazine or the New Yorker. Wouldn't that be lovely? It's just it doesn't matter. It used to be that having a book or having a short story published in the New Yorker would bump your sales of your book, and she's and it's still very much something that's esteemed, but you don't see it in terms of sales. And so I said, well, what does bump sales? She's if someone famous takes a picture with your book. And I said, well, that's just awful. And so it's really interesting because as I've gone through this process, Essie was lucky enough to be chosen as one of the 5 Book of the Month Club books. It happened to have been chosen by the guest judge, Troyan Belisario, I think, who's a famous person who was on Pretty Little Liars. And so as the book was coming out, there were pictures of her holding the book, and I was like, oh, this is something that people do. And so then you start sort of following, their different Instagram posts, and Reese Witherspoon has a book club, and Emma Watson has a book club, which I have to say was my daughter's favorite thing. She was like, so they're sending the book to Hermione? And I said, they are. I don't think she's going to pick it up and read it, but we will all keep our fingers crossed on that one. So it's just sort of a very interesting, I think, shift. I was not active in publishing before this moment in time right here, nor am I active now. I'm just along for the ride. But my sense is that it's changed pretty dramatically in terms of where people put their time and energy. And then there's a lot of sort of focus on Instagram and Twitter, which is interesting. I think it's, gives the author a chance to interact with people outside of bookstores. But it also sort of gives you this false sense that you actually have control over the matter, that you can say or post the right thing or the wrong thing that'll make people sort of engage or not engage. But it's been a fun, interesting learning experience nonetheless. Very different from medicine. I think there's a different level of stress that comes on with any new project. But people ask sort of what it's like, how does it compare? And it's interesting because nobody's tried to bite me at any of the events that I've done, and so on the whole it seems pretty tame by comparison. No one's thrown up on me. It's all good. Any other questions? Must be some. Yeah.
I just wondered what your parents' reaction is.
Yeah. So my mom read it first, and she was living in my house, and so she was right there, and she's like, "Oh dear God, please tell me I'm not this woman." And I was like, "You're not that woman." But there are pieces of my mom in Celia Hicks in that she has complete control over the household, and there are certainly pieces of my dad. My dad, I think, didn't think to ask whether any of this was based on him, which is the part of this that is based on him. That sense that Pastor Hicks is very invested in his ministry, in a very sort of like intellectual capacity. He's a deep thinker, and so does not notice dirty dishes in the sink, does not notice household chores that need to be done. Luckily, the Hicks family, I think, has people for that and enough kids that the chores get divvied up. But certainly there are little pieces of both of them in it, but not. Essie has a hard time, and I had a very tame childhood by comparison. But she's somebody who's like, oh, she's a great heroine.
She is.
Yeah, she's very spunky, and yeah, I'm excited for her. I think it was, just to sort of point out, that very short passage that I read at the beginning, they go to the hospital, and they interact with a doctor, and it was on purpose that be there at the outset, because you don't necessarily know it from the earlier chapters, but you sort of get a sense that something may not be right in her life, in her sister's life, in the family dynamics, and I think there's got to be something messed up about growing up on television, and I think a lot about sort of when John and Kate +8 was first on, I had a lot of deep, uncomfortable feelings about what effect this would have on the kids, whether they truly have the capacity to consent to that level of invasion of privacy. And, that is sort of up here, but every time I put a picture of my kid on Facebook, it's the same sort of, we just exist in a different world than I think I grew up in. And I don't know that we really understand how any of that's going to impact our kids as they get bigger. But it was important for me to have them interact with the doctor right at the beginning of the story, because I think I work in an emergency department, and so I see a lot of kids. I see a lot of repeat customers, but most of the kids that I see are folks that I don't know, and I'm trying to sort of decide in that split second that I'm walking in the room whether the vibe is okay, whether the story matches the injury, right? And kids fall down all the time, and there was one week where I saw the 3 boys in the same family, and by the 3rd visit the mom was like, "You're gonna call social services, aren't you?" And I was like, no, of course not, because 3 totally different things happened and they made sense, right? But you worry that you're missing something, and so it was important for me to have the doctor be there on the page, even though the doctor doesn't really play a role in the rest of the story, because I would feel very responsible if I had an opportunity to help and I missed it. And I think statistically speaking, I have done that. I've missed something. And then, we sort of take a look at all of us as consumers of social media and reality shows, and every time you click an article, you're sort of generating more interest, and people are going to make that content. So even if you're not watching the shows, even if you're peripherally aware, I think we all sort of contribute to that level of, exposure for them. And for, the older Kardashian young women, I think they're fully aware of how they're manipulating the system, and they're getting bonkers rich doing it. But I think there are younger people who certainly have been taken advantage of by the system in place to publicize their lives. And I think we all need to sort of think about how we respond to that and whether it's the right thing for us as a society. I don't see it changing anytime soon. I think we'll probably get to a point where we're a little bit bored with it, and the shine will be off some of the celebrities, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. There'll always be something more outrageous out there. Yeah. Anything else?
How old are your kids?
They are 6 and 8. So they both go to school.
Isn't it great?
And they both take the bus. And the bus stops right on the corner. And right before it comes to our house, it turns down a street that we can see. And so they know to go out to the bus stop. And so I took them to the bus stop on the first day of school. and never again. And I have friends who, like, their kids are in 4th grade, and they're like, you don't stand at the bus stop with them? No, I'm not. Still in my pajamas. Why would I go out? So it's been lovely, and they are in the Danvers Public Schools, which I think are sort of a nice little town. I didn't have, we bought a house that made sense for us because my parents were moving in with us, and so we looked all over the North Shore because I was not only working at Boston Children's but also at Beverly Hospital, where children's staffs the pediatric services. And so we were just like trying to find a place that would give everyone enough space to not go crazy in the same space. And I think we got lucky. We found a nice house, and we didn't know very much about Danvers going into it, but Danvers has been good to us, so yeah, feel lucky. Questions? Yeah, no, that's what I'm here for.
I have a daughter who's 20, and she's you without the science, which is unfortunate because she's really bright and she wants to be a writer.
Yeah.
That is really her dream. And she's majoring in creative writing and English right now. And she's got a good internship at Boston Magazine for the summer. And
Good for
she's
her.
learning editing, she's learning stuff. But she said to my husband the other night, I like it, except that I really want to be a writer. That's my goal. And
Yeah.
he said what your mom said.
Yeah.
But you do have to pay the bills. And so we've never discouraged her from she really is talented in my mother's opinion, as a mom. But I worry about that a lot. That, she's taking it, she's going to do this, but is it gonna work? I don't know. So do you have any advice?
Yeah, I mean, I don't.
She'd be here with me tonight, but she's in Boston.
Busy. Yeah, I don't think that there's one right way to do it. If you crunch the numbers, I would have been better off being an elementary school teacher because so if you take my student loans from medical school, so I was lucky to go to a state school. My parents were living in New York State at the time, and New York has really good medical schools. UMass was also a really good medical school, but I was lucky not to be somewhere without good schools. So I was able to go to medical school where tuition was like $11,000 a year at the beginning, and then there was a huge jump. But you're also borrowing money for living expenses. So I owe close to $200,000 in student loans. That's medical school and undergrad sort of combined because my parents couldn't pay for undergrad outright because Princeton costs like $60,000 a year. So I understand. So somebody has done the calculation that says if you go into medicine and you take out that money and then you are out of the job market for 4 years, out of the job market for however many years of residency training that you have because you don't get paid very well during that time, and then you make a reasonable salary as a doctor if you don't go into pediatrics, but that's okay. Then you ultimately, even though you're making more money at the tail end of your career, overall, if you had just gone and been a teacher right out of the gate, you would overall make more money for some X number of years. Wow. And so I feel very lucky to be able to put food on the table and to have a degree and a medical license that I think can travel with me. But I certainly, I also have a whole lot of debt, and I have not broken even by any stretch of the imagination in terms of my doctor salary. And then, I think I knew people in medical school who did it and then sort of have these moments of I think I want to be a kindergarten teacher. And I knew somebody, so medicine is sort of divided up. You do 2 years of classes, and then you do 2 more years of being in the hospital. And so after 2 years, she was like, I really want to be a kindergarten teacher, but I'm just not sure. And she should have had the luxury of doing that 3rd year of medical school where you actually are on the wards and learning whether this is something that you like. But she was worried that if she borrowed another year of tuition and living expenses and still wanted to be a kindergarten teacher, that she would never break even, that she would be in debt forever. And so, I think that there are not a whole lot of people who can pay their bills just by writing. That would be lovely. It's lovely to have any piece of paying my bills that comes from writing, because it feels wonderful to have other people love what you created. But I think there are a lot of other ways to pay your bills that don't involve going down a career that is sort of meant to be all-consuming, and taking out huge debt. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who start out doing magazine or newspaper jobs and sort of learn how to work to a deadline, is what I've heard, is that even if you have like very deep literary aspirations, there's something really useful in learning how to get the words count like down on the paper, how to meet a deadline, how to be a professional, responsible human being, and be a good colleague, and learn where the commas go, because I realized when the copy editors got my manuscript that I was wrong about where all the commas go. And they were very sort of like, they put the Word documentation, like, right, they do the stuff in the margins, but then there was this like introductory letter so that I wouldn't get mad. And they were like trying to sort of ease me into it, and I was like, no, I mean, you guys know better than I do. I believe you. I wasn't going to get my feelings hurt. I just feel lucky to be doing this at all. So I think, certainly people come to writing at very many different points in their career. I would not have written this story had I not been a pediatrician, I don't think, because, two of my protagonists are fairly young, and very much are a response to the young people who come into the emergency department, for things that don't feel like medical emergencies. There are a lot of people who come in for behavioral issues or for mental health problems, and certainly the emergency department and our hospital system in general should be there and should support people like that. But it's not something that I'm trained to ultimately like treat with a pill or with therapy. You need to sort of screen and get people into the right direction, and those services are so woefully underfunded that it's a very frustrating position to be in as a pediatrician, as somebody who wants to advocate for patients and that you're not doing right by them. And so this was a way for me to get some of that frustration off my chest, because I think there's a lot of this job that happens in closed doors in the hospital walls, but there's a lot of this job in terms of sort of wanting to advocate for health and wanting to advocate for wellness and our patients in the community as a whole, that can't happen within the hospital walls. And so it's been really lovely seeing so many people step up from the medical community and run for public office in this coming election cycle. I don't know that I would ever have the patience for that or the temperament for it, but it's necessary. And I think that I took my experiences and turned them into this, and some of the piece that I'm working out right now also stems from sort of access to healthcare and sort of what our responsibilities are in terms of a community for providing healthcare for people, which just sounds kind of boring, but we sort of gussy it up with a little plot and some characters and get the message across. But I think whatever she decides to do, then, that feeds her future writing endeavors. And if she wants to take out a lot of debt, she can still do it. But I took out a lot of debt and I'm never going to pay it off. That's okay. Maybe someday.
That's another fault in our system.
Yeah. I mean, it is what it is. I think we are, we're lucky to have all of the educational opportunities that we have. But we also don't have great sort of trade schools for people to go to. And I don't think encourage kids in the way that we should as communities. But maybe someday. Yeah. What else can I answer for people? I have a lot of thoughts about everything.
Well, what's your next book going to be?
Yeah, so I'm writing a story that takes place in a gated community, right on the border of the Rio Grande. And so I did not expect the border wall issue to sort of blow up quite so much. I've been working on this for quite a while. But it's sort of, the intention is to sort of explore sort of the idea that people are choosing to be more isolated in the communities that they live in in the Facebook groups that they interact with, and these sort of echo chambers, and sort of talk about the ways in which that's actually like really nice. It's really nice to isolate yourself. Like it's easier, and just sort of lend credence to that, because I think it is a struggle to put yourself out there and cross those borders. But ultimately I think it's necessary. And so we'll sort of deal with some of the changes that have been taking place, not only in Texas, but in a lot of rural communities where their healthcare system is sort of breaking down as smaller hospitals close down, which is something I feel strongly about. We're lucky here, like near where I live, you can't like walk down the street without tripping over a doctor. There's just a lot of us here in Massachusetts and in the Boston area. A lot of people train and then just never leave. But we certainly have a shortage of physicians, not necessarily in the country, but a shortage of people who are willing to be dispersed elsewhere, for many reasons. Some economic, some family-wise, good reasons, but I think we need a system that's going to overcome that before we can provide the care that I think everyone deserves. Yeah. Anything else?
When do you find time to write?
Oh, so I was working full-time when I wrote Essie. I wrote it in the sort of year leading up to the 2016 presidential election, because I was having a lot of feelings at the time, and I think sort of had been lucky enough to get a job that was shift work, and so I work a lot of evenings, I work a lot of weekends, and that did mean that once my kids started to go to preschool and school, that I had some daytime hours that I was free. I think a normal person would have like done the laundry or cleaned the house, but I just ignored that. And my mom would sort of like passive aggressively fold things for me. Like I would put the laundry on and then I would just leave it. And I knew that she would walk by it and eventually fold it. And so we had a lot of like, it was just this thing. It was our mother-daughter thing where she did my chores, and it's still letting me know how much I owed her, and I do. So I did have some extra help at home, and I did have some daytime hours where I was technically working full time, but I was, might be off for several days in a row, and I could sort of get things done. And it would be great if that was something that I could have sustained. But I think this story came and sort of needed to get out of my head to some extent, and I wrote it fairly quickly in the course of a year. I had written another manuscript sort of once I had started writing again that didn't really go anywhere and sort of hang together right. And I remember my husband was like, you have these 2 other books that you've written, like just fix them and send them off and sell them, but like this is ridiculous, you can't write another one. But I was like, no, I think this is the one that's, I feel good about this. And he was like, you always say that. I was like, no. So but it worked out, at least in the short term. And then when I got the book deal, I did ask my boss if I could go part-time, because I wasn't really sure what the editing schedule would look like. And, if somebody sort of sent me pages and said, get these back by this date, I really didn't want to not be able to meet those commitments. I felt like they had invested in the story and in the process, and I owed it to them as a grown-up. To meet my commitments. And I also didn't want to put too much strain on my colleagues if I needed to switch out of shifts. So I went part-time. And more recently it has been made clear to me that I will not be able to go down on my weekend hours despite being part-time. So I was still like working every other weekend. And that was not my boss's doing, but my boss's boss's doing. And so I did sort of go in and say, listen, this is not working. And she was like, I was wondering how long you would last. So I'm going to sort of try for a little while to just sort of pick up shifts that I want to pick up instead of overcommitting to them. And for the time being, I think the plan is to just do it during the day and not on the night. I've worked nights and weekends for like over a decade. And I want to see what it feels like to like go to bed in my own bed every night and have dinner with my kids every night and know that I'll be able to be there for soccer games and stuff on the weekend, and just see if that feels like a healthier balance for me. And I don't know that that's the right financial decision. Certainly not going to get my loans paid off sooner. But I think, you can only do so much. And as far, I don't intend to leave medicine. It's not the intention. But I want to be able to do both. And I feel like I have a lot of friends who do a lot of research. I have a lot of friends who do other things that are supported by their hospital and their job, but that are not clinical work. And I sort of want to, put my stake in the ground and say this is valid too. This is a legitimate way for a physician to sort of interact with the community and be an advocate for our patients, even though it's not recognized by the hospital. But that's fine, because I did get it in writing that they at least will not try to take my intellectual property, because they do make you sign. Yeah, I mean, I think the goal is that you don't develop some multi-million-dollar technology while working at the hospital and then sell it. But the agreement is very broad, and so technically covers anything you write or publish. And so it's been interesting to sort of negotiate that and be like, no, this is mine, not yours.
I'm
And to sort of
astounded at that.
say it again.
I'm astounded to hear that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, and they would say the intention is never to take anyone's non-medical work away from them. And my husband, the lawyer, would say, but that is not what the agreement says that they're asking you to sign. And so, I think this is one of those things that they've had to deal with over and over again, because there are a lot of people who do other things. And there's somebody who, shortly before I was renegotiating my contract, was thinking about joining the staff, and he has a startup. And so all of that intellectual property, the hospital should not be able to stake a claim to it. But none of us are lawyers. It's hard to, I certainly don't have the money to pay a lawyer to make sure that the agreement is good. So I'm lucky. I know a lot of lawyers. And then you sort of hope for the best. But it's a very interesting sort of balance between wanting to put yourself out there. At some point I had gotten in touch with them and said I was going to have to do some public speaking events, and that it would not be medically related, but that if they were at all concerned, they could get in touch with me and just let me know. And no one even wrote back to say they got the email. And so I said to the big boss, I said, I'm just a little nervous that nobody wrote back, because I want to make sure that I got in touch with the right person. And she said, well, what are you worried about? And I said, no, I just wanted to make sure that if they had any concerns, they had a chance to air them, and that I was going to, I wasn't going to do anything that they would be upset about. And also that I had covered my bases, just that I was being a responsible employee. And she's like, well, I think it's just a good rule of thumb to not say anything that would embarrass your mom or the president of the hospital. And I was like, well, that's ridiculous, because I embarrass my mom. Every time I open my mouth, something falls out that makes her blush. And then she followed that up by saying, so just don't say anything controversial, vaccines are for everyone. And I was like, but the American Academy of Pediatrics would say that vaccines are for everyone. And so just the fact that she was sort of advocating this completely wishy-washy, spineless stand, and I was like, thank you for the advice, but I am a big fan of vaccination, and now I have embarrassed her, apparently. But there's no telling sometimes what people respond to, so you just try to have a message, which is, I think, in this book, that everyone should be nice to each other, that you should stand up for what you think is right. Somebody did review it on Amazon. They were like, this got really political at the end. Otherwise, I really liked it. And I didn't find it political at all. That was not sort of where my head was. But if being nice to other people is a political agenda, then I have that. I do have that. Yeah. Anything else in the back? Guys, good.
I just loved it. I just want to tell you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
I got it from my library because I read a lot, so I can't buy. But I bought one tonight. And
Oh,
I'm gonna sign
thanks.
it for my husband's granddaughter, sort of.
Yeah.
So she's 15.
That's perfect.
15, so.
That's perfect. People ask me what age it's appropriate for, and I'd be like, well, I'd let my daughter's 8. And I was like, I'll let her read it in a few years, which is probably younger than a lot of people would. But I think, one thing that I really was trying to keep in mind in writing it is that there are some young protagonists. I think it's sort of right on that edge where some people have been like, this should be YA, and other people have been like, no, this is definitely adult fiction.
Yeah.
And I just don't know that there's a difference to some extent.
Right.
But I do know that there was a period of time where, like, every single teenage girl who came into the ER was reading The Hunger Games. And so, like, much as I have watched all of the Disney movies multiple times so that I, like, know the songs and can sing them when I'm, like, sewing the cut on a kid's face to distract them, I don't know that I do it well, but it's, like, I have a little performance. Yeah. No, suturing. I'm excellent at. I'm excellent at hitting a moving target. But that, you know, I read The Hunger Games thinking I will read this and then I will be able to understand and relate to them. And anytime I would talk to them, they were nice. But there was that, like, teenage eye roll and the sense that, like, I was trying to, like, elbow in on something that belonged to them. Mm-hmm. That it was their book, that I could read it if I wanted to, but that I would never really, like, understand it. And I think I got a lot of that, too, because I was a little bit of a precocious reader. When I was a teenager, I would grab things off of my parents' shelf and, like, try to talk to them about it. And, you know, they would be like, you'll understand better when you're older. And, like, some of that's completely legitimate because, like, I read Faulkner, and I'm not sure what he was talking about, but I'm glad I read it when I did. I'm glad that I reread it when I was older. But I really wanted this book to belong to everyone. And also I wanted it to be a quick enough read that the folks that I work with in the emergency department, who are, like, busy, who come from very different levels of, like, interest in literature, education level. Many of the nurses I work with went straight into nursing school, so never did, like, liberal arts education. And so a lot of them, you know, read a little bit, but not that much. And so haven't taken, like, a class where they'd read, like, a book since high school. And I just feel like if we are going to talk about the issues in this book, then the larger the audience and the more varied and diverse the audience, the better. And that would be lovely if young people read it as well. And I want them to read it, and I want their parents to read it, and I want everyone to talk about it together, so that if we can say these things out loud, then they can stop happening in the world. But, you know, we'll see. There was also this sort of idea that my publishers, you know, my agent said, how are we going to market this to the evangelical community? And my publishers were like, they're not going to read it.
Yeah.
But I do think, you know, that there are many people within the evangelical community for whom, like, the story could resonate.
Yeah.
But I don't know that they're publicly would be supportive of it, which is fine. But I hope it finds its way to its people because, you know, even if it's not the book that sort of brings you to your knees, the more people who are involved in the conversation, the better. And then the more chance there is that it finds its way to the people that it really is meant for and who need it. Did you have a question?
I was just curious if there was ever a chance for a different ending, that Essie would make a different choice. If you grappled with that at all, or if you were always going in that direction.
Yeah, so I won't give away the ending, but sort of in the climax, right after I had sort of come up with the scene where she was going to reach out to Liberty for help, that was the scene that I envisioned. And so it was about getting from point A to point B. And I wanted there to be sort of a sense that it was all of these decisions are difficult, and the road that she's walking is difficult for very many reasons. But that's where I wanted her to end up. You know, I don't know that I would have made the same. There are other choices that she makes, obviously, in terms of her pregnancy that might not have been my choice. But I wanted to stay true to her. But then I also really felt it was important to, you know, have her get that level of autonomy. Yeah, but when I first wrote it, at the very end, there's like a scene where, you know, she comes home from a trip. And in the first version that I wrote, there are cameras, so that she sort of stayed on TV a little bit. And my agent was like, he was like, that's just gross. She wouldn't do that. And I like sat with it and I was like, no, I guess you're right. Like, I sort of had this sense that maybe she would like flip the script and use it to her own advantage. But I think it's much more important to sort of you know, the goal is privacy and autonomy and sort of having that control. And I think there is a level of control that you lose anytime that you open your life up to be on camera over there. Yeah. Any last questions?
Thanks so much.
No, I
Megan.
think we're
That
good.
was great.
Perfect. Thank you so much.